There were lots of times in writing this book and working on other projects where, of course, I got stuck. We all get stuck. And this mantra kept coming back to me of like, get good at bad ideas.
I'm Nathan Maharaj, and this is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is George Newman, cognitive scientist and associate professor at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. His new book is How Great Ideas Happen: The Hidden Steps Behind Breakthrough Success. It's a guide to generating ideas, hopefully great ideas, and learning about mental habits that often get in the way, and also how creativity is a skill that you can train and exercise. George Newman, welcome to Kobo.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Nathan.
Let's start with the basics. What's a great idea? How do we know when we've got one?
The basics. Yeah. So I think that's a fantastic question. One way to think about what makes a great idea is in terms of ideas that have an effect in the world. And sometimes we think about those as like disruptive or transformational kinds of ideas, like that masterpiece or that hit song. But there's lots of ideas that can have more modest effects on our lives. Whether that's a new kind of kitchen tool that makes your life easier, or maybe even it's a new way of organizing your closet or something like that. So great is kind of a subjective term, but really the book is about how do we find ideas that have an effect and improve our life and stir our emotions, give us purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. The effect is really the thrust of it, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Now, it's a bit of a twist. We're still working the title here. Great ideas, from reading this book, great ideas don't happen, do they? They don't just happen. There's something you kind of have to work at. And what I think surprised me was how methodically one could work at it, because you do lay out the steps one might take on the path to that. Can you tell me a bit about that, about the active nature of creativity?
Well, I totally appreciate that reading because there was a little bit of a tongue in cheek there where we think about creativity as this kind of like light bulb moment, and that's kind of how it gets mythologized. But if you look at historical studies and the research, what emerges is a very different kind of picture where people are engaging in a lot of background work, a lot of things that we don't see that are kind of behind the curtain, if you will. And so the book is really drawing insights about, well, what is the nature of that process? And the analogy that I make is it's kind of like archaeology,
Mm-hmm.
and that we can think in a lot of ways about ideas as being out there in the world. And so we're taking these methodical steps as ways of trying to unearth or find them.
It is a discipline like archaeology, as you lay it out, and that's what this book is about. Is that creativity can be methodical, can be a discipline. It's not the vision I had of creativity. I think it's not the vision we popularly have. I think we think about. I think you alluded to this a minute ago. Just that we think about this brilliant genius who leaps from inspiration to action. Um, what's wrong with that image? How can we dislodge that image from our mind and maybe peek behind the curtain, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that myth or kind of like cultural myth. It makes for a really compelling story.
Mm.
But then when you dig around in the details, you find like, oh, well, it wasn't just one person. There were a lot of people involved, and in fact, it wasn't like the idea wholly came into existence at that moment. There were lots of little pieces of that idea, some of which had been around for tens of years, hundreds of years, maybe even longer, so that the person or even a group of people were drawing on a lot of different sources, right, to kind of create something new. So it's really trying to challenge this idea that like poof, in an instant, we get that kind of insight and now something new comes into the world, that actually it's a much more gradual, methodical process that builds kind of all of these small incremental steps.
And One of the interesting things about this was also that early on, you make very clear um, originality is kind of overrated. Like complete originality, it's not really where it's at. Not if we're trying to come up with stuff that we might actually build on. Can you talk a bit about that? I think it's multiple discovery is one of the terms you come up with. What do we get wrong about originality?
So the concept I use there is like originality ostriches,
Hmm.
and that when we think about doing something creative, we think like I'm going to do something that nobody's ever seen before, um, and really a lot of great ideas come about by kind of 95% of them are based in things that we know already and that exist in the world, and often it's that one little tweak or change that kind of unlocks something new. And we got some insights from this even in an experiment we did, a series of experiments where we asked home chefs to come up with sandwich recipes. And then we asked them, and in all cases, we said, we want your sandwich recipe to be as appealing as possible. We want to try to sell it to potential customers. And so we asked them how much they focused on making their sandwich tasty and how much they focused on making it original.
Hmm.
And basically, what we found is that our chefs predicted that the more original they made their sandwiches, the more tasty, the more appetizing they were going to be to customers. But then when we actually gave those sandwich recipes to customers, it was the opposite. That when people had focused on being like super original, they kind of forgot to make their sandwich taste good. And I think that's something that happens a lot to creatives is we focus so much on the novelty aspect that we don't think, well, how could this idea be useful or impactful or valuable to people in some way?
Yeah, sometimes we just want a Reuben, but 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 oh my God, I hadn't thought of a Reuben with a bit of kimchi on it. And and that's the breakthrough. And anything else with like getting overly original would be like, well, I guess this is something I never tasted before, but God, I'm wishing I'm still pining for a Reuben.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, it's those and there's great research from lots of different disciplines. A study that I really like in just looking at science that what makes for an impactful discovery in science, and it turns out that those types of kind of huge transformational discoveries in fact are like the majority of them like 90-95% are grounded in things that we know, and it's again that little tweak that really unlocks a new theory and makes those kind of giant leaps forward. And this is a principle that Bob Dylan has used in his songwriting, and Virgil Abloh, the fashion designer. And so in lots of different areas we see people taking advantage of these kind of tweaks approach.
Yeah, the point you make about scientific discovery is I think so important, especially now that we have a picture of the lone scientist. Bruce Banner is in the lab,
Yeah.
and he makes a breakthrough. And no one else in the world seems to be working on the same topic as Bruce Banner, which isn't how it works. It tends to be that a lot of people are kind of working on the same problem, and the real innovation is a unique perspective on a very narrow line of inquiry. Um, but it can have exactly, we've come back to our original definition, is a great idea makes a difference. It has an effect.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And that's, you're bringing up, you mentioned before this idea of multiple discovery, which is something that I talk about in the book that, okay, so now a lot of the idea is out there and somebody has this idea for a tweak. Well, a couple of people or few people can have the idea for the same tweak at the same time. And in fact, there's just this really fascinating pattern throughout history where, a lot of the inventions that we think about as kind of maybe one-offs, like the telescope or even the theory of evolution, that those actually were simultaneous discoveries or multiple discoveries that kind of happened by completely independent people at the same time.
Yeah. I think we've covered the first part, which is just coming up with lots of stuff. One of the archaeological, as you play out this archaeological metaphor, you talk about gridding. What's gridding? What do we do before we get to gridding? And then how do we do the gridding part? What does that entail?
So the archaeology concept is like, okay, let me divide this up into stages. The first stage is I'm surveying, I'm saying, where am I even going to dig? Where's going to be fruitful ground? And then gridding is all about making that search more organized.
Hmm.
And so one of the big concepts I talk about there is something I call a guiding question or having a guiding question, which is essentially just what is my thing and why should it exist? Who's gonna like it? Who's gonna respond to it? And again, this doesn't have to be a change the world, but it is some idea about who the audience is and how they're going to respond and what they're going to find meaningful. And that guiding question of my kind of what and why provides a compass, a way of kind of narrowing in to say, well, where am I in space? And then now can I, just like an archaeologist draws up grid lines and, a bunch of little squares, let me search through each one of those squares and take note of, oh, like this was kind of interesting and this seemed promising. And look, I didn't find anything over here as you get kind of closer and closer to narrowing in on your thing.
One of the things I took away from gridding as a concept was also that when we're working on something, when we're grinding through a problem or working on developing something, you can kind of get overwhelmed by how long it's been that you've been grinding away at it. And gridding is useful also. And I think being able to demonstrate yourself how much work you've done,
Yes,
that you've progressed through this many squares of the grid. You probably learned something in order to record in a way that makes sense to yourself what you've been through. You probably will be noting what you've taken away, and by the time you get to the 100th square in your grid, you're not the same person that examined the first one.
totally. Totally. I think that's a really important point. Like, you know, a big theme in the book is just dig,
Yeah.
just search for ideas, just keep generating. And, there were lots of times in writing this book and working on other projects where, of course, I got stuck. We all get stuck. Maybe I wasn't having the best day or whatever it is. And this mantra kept coming back to me of like, get good at bad ideas.
Yeah.
Really actually celebrating the fact that what I was churning out was like not so hot, but almost thinking about that as a way to like get to the good stuff that, well, okay, I've cleared these squares and all these squares contain stuff that's not so great. And so now I can, good, I'm getting closer to actually finding the thing. So actually kind of celebrating those moments of, oh yeah, I'm still making progress on this project, even though it maybe doesn't feel that way at first.
Yeah. You talk about the difference between top down and bottom up creativity. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So this comes from an idea in cognitive science just about how we move around in the world. And so top-down processing is when we, walk into a room and we have our expectations about what's going to be in there. This is it could be a chair and some people, et cetera, et cetera. And bottom-up processing is processing that comes from really just paying very close attention to the sensory information, the sights and the sounds and the smells. And so those are different ways that we form representations of the world. And applying that idea to creativity, the notion there is that a lot of times when we set out to find great ideas, we're kind of operating in this top-down way, which is like, I want my idea to look like this. I'm expecting to see this kind of thing, and arguing for many examples and a lot of research which shows that actually taking the opposite kind of approach where I'm bottom up, really just paying very close attention to what's around me can be a really useful way of figuring out where there are interesting problems or questions or things that I could be working on. So kind of changing our attention to the environment around us.
Also, I think paying attention to your own responses to things, because so much of the top down approach seems to me to be you're throwing ideas out before properly examining them because you've already decided what great is going to look like, and you're not letting yourself explore. You're not responding to your own curiosity or even your own revulsion, because you talk about that too. Like, steer into what you know is a bad idea. Go all the way into it, see what comes out.
Yeah, like one of the examples I give related to that is Joanna Griffiths, who founded Knix,
Yeah.
and she founded the Knix brand from Toronto. Founded Knix when she was in graduate school,
This is the
and
line of absorbent undergarments, which today we know as like menstrual underwear that like is reusable. Is actually super useful stuff. It's brilliant.
totally, totally, and it has built this huge brand around that. But when she first started pitching the idea, basically everybody said, like, we don't need this. This isn't important. It's too niche an area, which, I think was a very kind of top-down response. But she had really built the business and built the idea for the business in this bottom-up way, which is just asking women, hey, like, what's missing?
Yeah.
What's missing from the marketplace? What do you think you need? And this is the response that she was getting back. And so, I think it's a really cool illustration of the difference in those types of thinking, where you had maybe a lot of acquisition people saying, like we don't need this, or we know this already, and that being kind of very top down, but really the bottom up approach being very powerful.
It's kind of counterintuitive to think of constraints as an aid to creativity. Think about like stuff getting in the way, and surely the creative mind must be unencumbered.
Yes.
But apparently, constraints help. It actually helps to have limits. Can you explain what's going on there? Why does it help to be constrained at least a little bit?
Yeah. So I talk about this as like thinking inside the box. And actually, the story of the think outside the box is an interesting one. We could, get into it in the book. But what the research actually shows is those constraints can actually be really powerful for shaping our thinking, because they give us something to react against, and they help us to kind of narrow in and have these more focused guiding questions. So I'll give an example from a great study that was done by Paige Moreau and Darren Dahl, where they had participants just generate ideas for children's toys. And in one version of the study, they said, just come up with children's toys, anything you want. And in the other version of the study, they picked these like 5 shapes, like randomly, but it could be like a cone and a handle and a square. And they said, well, you can come up with whatever you want, but it's got to incorporate these 5 shapes in
Mm.
some way. And then they took all of these toy designs that participants had generated in the two versions of the study, and they gave it to a panel of experts who, had worked in the toy industry for a long time. What they found was that those who were given the constraints, these very rigid constraints of your toys have to use these 5 shapes in them, actually came up with better toy designs. And it turned out when they looked at their logs that participants had been keeping, that it was really because they had kind of started the ideation process in a very different kind of way. And rather than thinking about existing toys like, a stuffed elephant and a train and whatever, they said, okay, look, I've got all these random shapes. What possible thing could connect all these ideas, which led them
Mm.
into completely different types of creative territory. And that's actually what can happen a lot with constraints, is even though they may seem limiting, they actually open up a lot of new territory and terrain, because we start our questioning process in a very different way.
It also seems that constraints can be um it's something on the page. You'd be facing a blank page, but at least you knew with this toy example, is it going to be a stuffed toy? Is it going to be a building toy? Is it an electronic toy? Well, I don't know, man. It's got to have these shapes. So
Yeah.
so we're starting with things in which these shapes can be manifest, which is a lot better than a blank page in many cases.
Totally, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a huge part of it, is that you have already you're already kind of moving in the process. You're already searching somewhere.
Yeah.
And even getting over that kind of blank page hump, can be a big one, right? And so that this is a good way to get us on our way.
Yeah, it's almost like the inverse. Is it the inverse? Is it just an echo? But it does seem to rhyme with what we talked about earlier about scientific inquiry proceeding from an edge of knowledge,
Yes.
and just being that little margin, that little extra bit of information past that. That you could look at that as a constraint. Given that we know this is the proteins behave this way, this is what we know about quantum theory. therefore the question we have is this the case, or is this the case, or is this the case? And that's what we're going to test.
Yeah.
We're not going to boil the ocean that is the universe. We're
Yeah.
just going to find out these few things.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Totally. And even if you're thinking about, if it's something like my students' projects, in my class or something like that,
Yeah.
I think the same kind of rules apply that even though it seems like, oh, like this kind of wide open territory, that there's a body of knowledge there. There's a lot to build on. There's a lot to react against. And so, one of the big first steps that we have to take is like, okay, well, what is that telling us? And then secondly, what kinds of rules and constraints is it setting up that we can then pivot from or react against?
Yeah. One of the interesting aspects of constraints, sparking creativity that I really loved was, I think you talked about child's play and entering fictional worlds. What it made me think of as a book person was fan fiction.
Mm.
It's such a fertile area even right now. Like there are now books that are being written and published to great success that were adapted from fan fiction, which is just people writing into the space of a story and characters and setting that they already know, that others know, and they're being creative within some pretty defined parameters. So for folks who are maybe struggling a little bit with this idea that constraint breeds creativity, can you talk a bit about this play aspect of like entering fictional worlds?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's such a great connection. So, um, th- you know, different philosophers and psychologists have talked about this idea that there are all of these tacit things that we understand about the rules of fiction. That SpongeBob can't interact with Superman's world,
Right.
or vice versa. And also kinds of rules that typically fictional realms will change maybe one or two things that seem odd, like maybe there's no gravity in this world. But then there could be lots of other things that we're going to just assume to be very similar. People think the same way and they need oxygen and, all the biology is the same, et cetera. And if you change too much about those worlds, then suddenly they start to not make a whole lot of sense. So we have this intuitive grasp of fiction, and that sets up some constraints for us. And Nathan, I think it's such a cool connection to fan fiction because now the constraints are even greater, right? I'm operating in this space that's known, and with character psychologies that are known and kind of constraints and relationship dynamics, but that actually provides all this unique fodder for, okay, well, what if I take the step one step further in this direction, and what if I take it one step further in this direction, and that actually being a really powerful way of unlocking new territory, even though it seems like it's so very constrained to begin with.
Yeah. In the digging phase, is it a question of generating quantity over quality? Because I think a lot of what we've been talking about is how to just like fill a list and then twist it this way and then twist it that way. Is it really quantity over quality, or does one even consider quality at one of these early stages? Are you just trying to pile things up?
What I really advocate for the book is, to the best you can, just put any notion of quality to the side at
Yeah.
that stage. You're just getting stuff out of the ground. Like, just in the same way, if you were on an archaeological dig, you don't know exactly what's something very recent versus something very old that might be important. You're just getting all of the stuff out, and then you're going to go back later and see what's really there. And there's a lot of research which suggests that once we start engaging in that editing process and kind of filtering as we're trying to generate ideas, what winds up happening is we just generate far fewer ideas. And because of that, we're actually less likely to get to the really, really good stuff. And we kind of give up much earlier. So, just as a general strategy, let me put that inner explainer to the side while
Mm.
I'm digging, and just let me get everything I can out of the ground. I'm going to worry about how good or bad it is later.
In the final section, you talk about sifting. And that's where you start to actually make the thing. You're not just organizing what you've come up with or what you think you might come up with. You're starting to make something. Now, what's that critical difference between making the thing and organizing all the stuff you've generated?
Hmm. It's an interesting contrast. Like I think about the sifting stage as I'm really now starting to ask hard questions of like, does this satisfy what I
Mm,
was looking for? If I go back to my guiding question, is this really what I was kind of looking for to begin with? And we make really interesting mistakes on either side. That there are a lot of times, and in some of my own research, I found this where we get pretty attached to our ideas, mostly because we're the person who thought of them. And in fact, if you take those same list of ideas and you hand them off to somebody else, those people are actually more accurate at predicting what experts and others are going to see as the best ideas in the set. So there's something about the actual act of generating ideas that makes us pretty attached to them. But we also screw up in the other direction,
mm,
which is we can have trouble recognizing very, very promising ideas. And I think this is a really fascinating phenomenon too, because part of what's driving that is these ideas that really are great or have a very large effect in the world. A lot of the times they're kind of abstract and they're going to be kind of new. And
mm,
maybe even the first time we think of them or the first time we come across them, they might feel kind of even foreign, right? Like the brain likes to process things that are familiar and known, and when it comes across something that's kind of unfamiliar, you say, I don't like that so much. Um, and so, really fascinating work showing that actually it's these ideas that feel a little bit uncomfortable or strange that can turn out to be some of the most effectual later on.
mm. What's the grumpy Yoda technique?
So grumpy grumpy Yoda came about in trying to what are different ways that we can then more accurately sift and especially kind of addressing this problem of I'm probably hanging on to too much stuff. There's too many parts of my idea, or there's too many ideas that I think are promising, or whatever it might be. I gotta be kind of more selective. That one strategy can be to imagine somebody that is first very wise.
Mm.
This is the Yoda part, who knows a lot about what you're doing. But then now also imagine them that they're really grumpy. They're just like in a real bad mood, and they're just shooting everything down. And and I found over time that can be an incredibly useful voice to have inside your head. That you don't want to do it as you're generating material. If you're an author while you're writing, you don't want to have that voice in your head while you're writing. But when you're editing later and going back and saying, well, what's really of value here? Having that grumpy Yoda, well, what's Grumpy Yoda going to say about this? For me, it was a former colleague. What
Mm.
is Grumpy Yoda going to say about this? And that being such a powerful way of kind of sharpening and refining. And what I think is so cool about it as a psychologist is it's all coming from you. It's all stuff that was in your head, but you seem to really be accessing a different part of your knowledge or ability to simulate other people that winds up being super valuable in the creative process.
Yeah, it made me think of, I mean, I know there are some book business people that listen to this show and probably a few editors, and I would love to ask an editor what they make of the grumpy Yoda technique, because book editors tend to, I think in their hearts there's a grumpy Yoda, but what comes out of their mouth has to be a lot softer than that, because as you say, they're dealing with an author who's been assembling all of these great ideas that they came up with, and so they may be overly attached to it, and to discard it and retain that relationship where you still have the trust and openness. That is a whole other book, actually.
Yeah, right.
I feel like we've just been brainstorming like your second book, like, oh, now we figured out how to
Yeah,
deliver
that's
the
right.
information, how to filter things down.
Yeah. What to do with great ideas. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. No, I mean, and I think you're highlighting like a really important tension, which is in part why the grumpy Yoda has to come from us, is that there are social niceties, right?
Yeah.
That a lot of times our ideas need this really critical feedback that is just hard to give and hard to solicit. And there are these going to be these natural barriers. So the better that we can get at becoming our own critic, but still like doing that in a way that's going to encourage our work and push it forward. And so that's kind of, separating first the generation from the sifting. But it's also, okay, well, if I was going to get really good at imagining what my harshest critic was going to possibly say, you know, maybe I'm actually going to get some of the most insightful comments, even though they're coming from me, because the other folks, they're probably thinking that same thing too, but they're maybe not going to phrase it, in the same way or give us that kind of tough analytical look that we need.
Well, that brings me to the idea of building a tower versus floating a raft. This one really struck me because, I mean, partly because as we speak now, only a few days ago I spoke with writer Suvankam Tamavongsa, and a hot take she had was that when she's reading some novels, sometimes as a poet, as an accomplished poet that she is, she's marveling at like, wow, there's just sentences in here that don't need to be here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bloat, and you can kind of see the author's research and their own attachment to all the research they did
Yeah.
as it's like stuffed in there.
Yes.
And this is me externalizing it, but the fact is, I've struggled with this in preparing interviews. My script will often be packed full of all of the brilliant insights and things I've observed in the book
Yeah.
that do not cohere into a conversation.
Yeah, totally.
I'm tower building, right? That's building the tower.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, this is something that we all do, and it's such a fascinating tension because yeah, like there's just this natural human impulse that when you've been immersed in something, we want to say, look, here's like everything we did.
Yeah.
I give my toddler, right? Like she's just going to grab everything that's in her immediate radius and that's going into the tower. And it's an expression of how much I care about it and how much effort's been expended and here are all these great thoughts about it, etc. But your audience is not in the tower business. They're in like the raft inspection business, or at least
Yeah.
that's what I say.
Yeah.
That they're not evaluating your idea for how tall it is or how much stuff is in there. They're evaluating for, is this watertight? Does
Yeah.
it make sense? Do all of the pieces need to be there? And just, as a psychologist, what's so deeply fascinating there is like, yeah, exactly as you said, the very same person, me, you, all of us, when we're evaluating other people's work, sure, of course. Yeah, like you don't need this and this and
Yeah.
this. And
Yeah. You lost me here. This part sags. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But then when it comes to our own stuff, we're right back into the building the tower thing. And so, just having, I think, having that in your back pocket, for me at least, has been hugely helpful. That I can just be, or my wife could say to me, like, are you building a tower here? And I know exactly what it means. And oh God, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And getting to think about the work in a different way.
Yeah, and the opposite of that, just to make it clear for listeners, the opposite is you're building a raft. And the metaphor of the raft coheres around the idea that it's not going to sink, that
Yeah,
it's seaworthy.
yeah,
All the materials that went into your tower don't matter. What matters is that the thing you built is a raft. It goes somewhere. It travels, it holds up. It's not leaky.
yes.
It has a direction and it holds a direction. Like you can the metaphor can be spun out, but it really is about making a thing that fits a purpose. And the tower, sorry, tower builders out there, we're towers seem less purposeful.
Yeah, and it's so funny that I just had a wonderful meeting with a structural engineer yesterday. We were talking all about creativity and like talking about exactly this kind of thing, right? Which is so central to that. Like everything has got to be there and serve a purpose. So yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think it applies like even in these really abstract or seemingly kind of abstract domains like artwork or something like that. Chances are if something didn't resonate with you in a film or whatever it might be, it's probably because you had this like vague sense of like, did that really need to be in there? Like, did we
Mhm.
need that scene or
Yeah.
whatever? And so I think it is a very kind of broad concept to lots of different types of creative endeavors.
Yeah. I wonder if as an academic, was that a hard pill for you to swallow where you realized towers and rafts? Was that like was it feels like in a tower there's safety of having shown your work and your eminent competence as a
Yeah.
researcher.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that, like on a personal level? How did it feel to to solidify this insight?
Yeah, so this came about actually. So in academics, um, a big kind of currency are these talks,
Yeah.
and you give talks in your own department, and you get invited to go to other school, and in a talk you're basically just describing your research. Like what did we do, and what did we find, and what was the purpose. But there's actually a lot that goes into crafting a talk, and it's really important. It's like how a lot of academic hiring, all academic hiring happens. Um, and um, and what I had noticed over the years of just listening to a lot of these talks and then kind of thinking about my own work is how much of it was like tower like. How much of
Hmm.
it was when I was reacting negatively to something, it was like, oh, that didn't need to be there. And and we could have just jumped to this study, and we didn't need this kind of point and this detour. But then when it's time for your talk, there
Yeah.
is that impulse to put everything in there. And once I kind of had that realization about talks, well, I'm using that on my own talks, and I'm talking to my students about it, and now it's also spilling over into my teaching and realizing how much more streamlined and kind of on point that I can make by teaching. So it was this kind of very organic process that came out of noticing this one domain and then realizing, oh, like this idea actually applies pretty broadly.
Hmm. Yeah. How did you come to study creativity as a field and to end up writing this book?
So, it's a topic that I've always been fascinated with. Both my parents are classical musicians. My brother was a musician. I originally had wanted to be an artist and like a visual artist, and so even just growing up, we had lots of conversations around the dinner table about creativity and kind of where ideas come from and different composers and how they fit into one another. And then, I decided to get a PhD and kind of go down this cognitive science track. But I remained really interested in just what is this process? Where does it come from? How do we evaluate the creative works of others? And so it was really kind of like a marriage of like, well, I've got this thing that now I'm deeply fascinated in of cognitive science and all of these tools, and let me like now try to understand this lifelong passion
Hmm.
of creativity, and specifically the book was really trying to make sense of you have all of these creatives throughout history, talking about the ways in which their ideas weren't brain born, where the way in which their ideas were very much a product of discovery, whether it's Edison or David Lynch talking about ideas are like fish, you just catch them, or Stephen King talking about actually archaeology and kind of unearthing these dinosaurs, and sometimes it's a huge whopper and sometimes it's a little guy, um, and so I really wanted to say, well, what happens when we take that idea seriously, or can we take that idea seriously, and what is the effect? And the more I started kind of digging into that concept, the more actually things really became into to focus, and I was able to make sense of a lot of existing findings in the literature and kind of put them under this umbrella.
Hmm. Every section of this book, How Great Ideas Happen, ends with some exercises. And and I was surprised and delighted to see it wasn't just one exercise. We don't get to the end of of a chapter and then you say, now do this. You throw a bunch of exercises at the reader. What I found in trying to, as we talked about earlier, like attuning to what's my own intuition telling me, where am I saying, yep, let's do that, let's know, was like as I'm going through, I'm like, I'm looking at an exercise and thinking, no, that's dumb, I don't want to do that. But I did catch myself dodging one exercise and then landing in the grip of another.
Yes.
I think it's a really interesting approach. Tell me about these exercises and your strategy in putting them in front of the reader as you brought them through this framework.
I really think, especially about these exercises, as kind of like this, like buffet,
Yeah.
and okay, well now what are ways in which we could actually make these ideas practical and apply them? And some of them are more visual in nature, and some of them are more kind of conceptual in nature. Some of them are like really concrete, and some of them like kind of abstract. And so, some of them are like games. But the idea is really twofold. One, maybe something there strikes you and you say, oh, that's like pretty cool. I want to give that a shot. Um, and I find that this is what often happens to me, is, I'll read it and I'll say, oh gosh, I like that, but it like actually cues this different thing for me. And I kind of want to like take part of that exercise and run in this different direction. And then it winds up being this like actually really useful thing that I use. And so thinking about the exercises both as something that you can kind of play around and experiment with, and you could go through it a very kind of systematic way through all of them, or you could kind of read it with a little bit like taking a step back and say, well, like, I wouldn't approach it exactly this way, but this really cues something cool for me. And I think I could take something of this and actually integrate it into my process or work.
George, thank you so much for joining us. This was fun.
Thanks so much, Nathan. I had a blast.
I have been speaking with George Newman, author of How Great Ideas Happen. Find it at Kobo and Conversations home on the web. That's kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Follow us in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, it would be an absolutely fantastic idea to tell someone about it or rate it 5 stars. We leave it up to you. You've got to choose. This is your creative journey. Kobo in Conversation was produced and hosted this time by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.